You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Quinn C. Burlingame. We're going to be talking about a semiconductor breakthrough that could be a game changer for organic solar cells. So, Quinn, thanks for coming. How you doing?
Yeah, great to be here, Richard. Things are going well.
Well, good. Tell me a little bit about your background and then why the focus on solar cells and these particular kinds.
Great. So I am basically an organic electronics researcher. And by organics, I mean things that contain primarily carbon and tend to be kind of hydrocarbon-based things. So polymers would be organic materials and semiconductors. And you can also make smaller molecules like the ones I primarily work with, which are still carbon-based, but you can either evaporate them or process them in solution to make all kinds of thin film devices. So I basically started out in research kind of right after my undergrad, working just in organic electronics laboratories and doing that kind of research. I was working on all sorts of different just sort of materials development work. And one day I heard about this idea called an organic solar cell. And these are things that have actually been around for a while now. And you can essentially make a multi-layered electronic device out of these organic semiconductor materials. And you can make a fully functional solar cell. So hit it with light and it creates electricity. And there's just a ton of really interesting things in physics and chemistry and material science that you can do with these devices to really push them and give them all kinds of applications that you can't do with other sort of solar cell devices. So I just kind of fell in love with the field and ended up doing my PhD working on those devices, and now continuing my research here at Princeton and with the startup company.
So what's the difference between what's an organic solar cell made of, for instance, versus a traditional solar cell?
So a traditional solar cell, like the ones you would see out in big solar fields or on people's roofs, those are almost entirely silicon. They have a totally dominant market share, and they're pretty efficient. They're very reliable. They're kind of bulky and heavy and big, but they do the job very well. Our cells are made out of these tiny little organic semiconductor molecules. So they're carbon-based compounds. I think the material that we're primarily going to maybe focus on today, because that is kind of the title of the podcast, is made entirely of carbon. It's called carbon-60. So it's just 60 carbon molecules, 60 carbon atoms attached to each other in sort of a little ball. It's called a Buckyball, or carbon-60. So these are the kind of molecules we use. And because of their, I think an easy way to think of them is sort of as plastics. Those would be polymers, but our materials are very similar property-wise. They can be very thin, flexible. You can make them absorb wherever you want. Sort of, if you want to absorb visible light with organics, no problem. If you want to absorb infrared light, no problem. If you want to absorb UV light, you can make them just by sort of changing them chemically. You can make them do just about anything you want, and you can make the devices flexible, and they have just a huge application space where with silicon solar cell, the devices that are really sort of transforming our landscape and making waves with really large scale deployment, they are what they are. And silicon looks like silicon looks, and it's going to be big and heavy, and it's always going to sort of have that form factor. And those are fantastic devices that have a place. But we're trying to kind of fill in some of the gaps and put devices where silicon can't really get to easily.
Right.
So what about a layered solution where light is going to be incident upon a series of organic cells, and let's say the visible is captured first, and then the rest of the light it's transparent
Yeah,
to, and that filters through the next layer, and it captures the UV, and then et cetera, et cetera.
exactly. Yeah. So this is a concept that's out there called a tandem solar cell, and you can potentially make a tandem solar cell with anything where you have a layered structure like that, and primarily you'll put like the UV absorbing layer in the front because that'll absorb the UV. Then you put a visible layer, and then you put an infrared layer in the back, and then you can essentially put all those devices in series, and you can get a much higher efficiency that way. So organics are really perfectly suited for that purpose. The world record efficiency cell for an organic is currently made that way. It's got two different junctions, one that's absorbing sort of the infrared and near infrared, and then another one that's absorbing the visible and up to UV, maybe 350 or 400 nanometers light in that range. And outside of those tandems, that wavelength flexibility is something that we really take advantage of a lot with my current research. So we're developing totally transparent solar cells that are basically imperceptible. You just think you're looking at glass when you look at them, and that's because the organics are just absorbing the UV portion of the spectrum. So we can get a nice high voltage in our solar cell from those high energy photons in the solar spectrum, and you can totally see through it as if it's not even there.
But again, what's the goal? Is it efficiency, or is it being able to use them in places where traditional solar cells can't be used?
So I guess speaking of the entire field of organic solar cells, it is the latter thing. So it's finding applications where, right, if I just want to make as much power as possible, and I don't care about the weight or appearance of my solar cell, like if I want to put it on a building that can support that, a silicon cell is going to be the best way to go. Cost per performance. There are definitely solar cells that are much higher performance, but would also be higher cost, like compound semiconductor stuff like gallium arsenide. So the case that organics are making is that we can potentially make them integrated into Windows. We can potentially make them easily basically roll to roll processed. So you can have a big sheet of organic solar cell that you can roll out on your roof. You don't have to have any additional infrastructure, and it just works. So it's sort of right now it's stretching the possibility space of where solar can be. And in our case, it's with transparency. With other people, it's with total flexibility and different applications like that.
So, what are some examples? Where can organic solar cells be used, and what's the difference in using them?
So they're still essentially a research phase technology right now. So what we're doing with them is making a window integrated solar cell that can be used to power all kinds of things. And the specific target application that we think about a lot is with electrochromic windows. And these are essentially transparent devices that you can apply a voltage to, and they will then change their color. So this can be, there's already some examples of this in like cars and in some like airplane windows where the window itself is dimmable, and you can basically have a little controller that you apply a voltage to that window and it changes color. So with us, we can generate the power to power that element from the solar energy that's coming through the window using an organic solar cell. So that's sort of an application that makes use of the advantages of absorbing UV photons, which is that you get a nice high voltage. So it sort of matches that application really nicely. And there's other sort of other aspects of the technology where people are primarily absorbing the infrared spectrum. The solar spectrum has a ton of light out in that part of the spectrum, so you can get lots of efficiency, and then you can just use that power for sort of general use, just to supplement your building's power.
So why don't so traditional solar cells, they're just capturing the visible spectrum, or are they capturing infrared or UV?
Primarily, yeah. So silicon goes out to about around 1100 nanometers. So it's a little bit into the infrared. We can see out to about 740 or 750 nanometer light. So silicon gets all the visible and then out a little bit into the infrared. And that's essentially for a single a single material solar cell, that's about as good as you can do. You can get maybe a little bit more efficiency squeezed out of it, but silicon is sort of serendipitously positioned in a really good spot to have efficient solar energy generation.
So again, what are the efficiencies of traditional solar versus organic solar cells?
So in laboratory scale, you can get silicon about 26%, I believe. The current world record for an organic cell is a little over 17%, and that's a multi-junction. So they are, soft materials that are not as efficient and currently not as reliable, which is why they're still sort of a research-based technology. If you look at the trajectory that they're on, however, I think there's pretty good reason to believe that we'll be very close to those other technologies within a couple of years. So it's really increased.
Why is it different efficiency? What's the mechanism by which normal solar cells work versus organic? Why is there an efficiency difference?
So the materials are totally different. So if you look at like the conductivity, the absorptivity, all of these things are very different for the two materials. A organic solar cell is excitonic. So when you absorb light, you make an excited state that's called an exciton, where the electron and the positive charge stay bound to each other, and then you need to use basically a junction between two materials to separate out that and get the current. In a silicon solar cell or a normal inorganic solar cell, as soon as the light comes in, you're making the electron and the electron and the positive charge at the same time, and they're already free. So that saves you a little bit of energy because you don't have to pull them apart. So you sort of you do benefit in other ways by using the organic. So you have something that's flexible and something that's much more tunable, but it's also it's made of plastic, so it's not as conductive as silicon is, and it's you need to do a little more work to get the charges out of it, I suppose.
Is there a trade-off? Is there a problem of charge conduction in traditional silicon, where you have to control it or you lose part of it, versus organic solar cells where I guess it stays where it's made?
I don't think so. So the main, there's so many differences between these material sets because silicon is this continuously bound array of atoms that are all just sort of sharing electrons freely throughout this entire bulk material. The organics are these isolated molecules that aren't really strongly bound together. They're sort of soft and squishy and not strongly bound. So one of the reasons that you would want to even use them in the first place is that the organics interact with light a lot more strongly. So if I want to absorb all the light in the visible, I can do that with maybe 100 nanometers of an organic material, where if I want to do that in silicon, I need several microns of material. So they're totally different optically, but silicon does a great job. Obviously it's in integrated circuits everywhere. It's a great conductor of charges. So they do just fine in that sort of thick form factor. They're able to get charge extracted, no problem. And in organics, because their conductivity is so much lower, I think we're the ones who have to work a bit harder. And that's one of the main challenges in our field right now, is to get the conductivity and the charge mobility of organics up to a level where we can actually extract charges out of a device.
Well, how do you extract them? Do you let them build up for a period of time and then extract? Is it like more of a pulse system where silicon continues?
They flow. They're flowing out continuously. So to really break it down, you basically have light coming in. It creates this excitonic state, which is a bound electron hole pair. That exciton can sort of diffuse around. It can hop between molecules, and then it reaches this interface between two different organic molecules. So every organic solar cell has this junction of two organic molecules at it. The exciton, basically, one carrier as part of the exciton, either the electron or the positive charge, will jump across that barrier. So then you'll have one charge on one side of the junction and one side on the other, one charge on the other side of the junction, and then they will separate there, and then they can conduct their way out. So it's quite a different sort of charge generation mechanism than you have in other cells.
So okay, where does the inefficiency come in? With traditional solar and organic, why is it? Again, I can't complain. Why is it only 26%? Why is it only 17%? Where's the rest of it going?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So starting with normal, let's say, the inorganic silicon solar cell. So based on where you have the band gap or energy gap of your material, that determines how much of the solar spectrum you can absorb. So if you look at a plot of the solar spectrum, we're getting all this UV light way up in the high energy space, this visible light down in the sort of middle energies, and then this huge tail of infrared light that goes out, way out. So about, I think roughly 60% of the light is in the infrared, and then 40% of the light is in the visible and UV. So if I put my silicon band gap at whatever number it is, which is around 1100 nanometers, that means I can absorb the light that's higher energy than that, but all that light that's beyond 1100 nanometers, I can't touch it. It's too low energy to be absorbed by my silicon. So there's a huge amount of energy loss that happens right there because you're just not absorbing it. So you could, in theory, put out a much essentially lower energy gap semiconductor, and then you would absorb more of the solar spectrum. But then you're going to be limited in voltage because the energy gap of the material determines how much voltage you can get out of the cell. So there's essentially an optimum of where you can place your band gap in the solar spectrum to get the most possible or the best possible combination essentially of number of photons absorbed and the voltage that you can extract those charges at. And let's say
modulate the band gap by what, doping the silicon? Is that how it's done?
In silicon, the band gap is the band gap. You can't really change it. You can literally change it a little bit by straining it and stuff, but that's not commonly done. It's just silicon is what it is. If you want a different band gap semiconductor, you can change the semiconductor, but you're totally stuck with silicon. In our space, this is like the main advantage of organics is that you can use organic chemistry and synthesis to just make any compound you want. You can make the energy gap of your organic semiconductor anything you want it to be. So they're super flexible, and they can, not flexible mechanically, which they also are, but flexible synthetically and chemically. So you can sort of shift their absorption around wherever you want it to be.
So you're making a composite material of organic molecules that cover a spectrum of various band gaps, or how is it?
Yeah. So like I said, there's basically two components to every organic solar cell. So we have those two materials that are on either side of the heterojunction. So I can basically have the absorption of those two molecules be complementary to each other, which is great, right? So I can have one that absorbs a little bluer, one that absorbs a little redder, and then they'll share nicely and they'll absorb in different parts of the spectrum, and you'll be happy. And you can also make a multi-junction cell where it's several different pairs of those materials. So you can have 3 junctions, and I would have 6 different organic molecules, each of which I can make absorb in whatever part of the spectrum I want. And then you can really get very broad spectrum coverage with your organics.
But if the sunlight's coming in on the z-axis, are they just side by side, or are they one below another?
They would be one below. Yeah, they'd be one below. So right, exactly. So if it's coming in on the z, your first solar cell will be in the XY plane. Your next solar cell will be in the XY plane below that on the z-axis, and your third one will be in the XY plane below that on the z-axis. So you stack them up that way. Otherwise, if I'm putting them sort of next to each other in the x-axis, then I might as well just put the most efficient cell everywhere. Right? There's no benefit to.
How many layers can you go where there's no transmission after a while?
It really depends on the material. So with our basically UV absorbers, I can make it extremely thick. I can make it like a big pane of glass before you'll really notice it. If you're looking at it sort of on the peak absorption, so where an organic material absorbs very strongly, you can easily absorb 99% of the light within 100 nanometers or 50 nanometers of the material. So they do interact really, really strongly with light, which is why they're such great optical materials.
So do you end up making a sandwich of 3 layers, or more often than not, you just make one layer that absorbs the most strongly?
So in a practical device, I would say the minimum you'll ever see is, let's see, so you have a bottom electrode, you have what we call a hole transport layer, which conducts your positive charge. You have the donor and the acceptor, which are these 2 organic materials in the heterojunction that I keep talking about. So those are 2 layers. And then you have a top layer, which is an electron transport layer. And then you have an electrode on top, which is usually metal or something like that. And for a transparent application, it would be something other than metal. But I think the kind of minimum viable structure you'll normally see is a 6-layer like that. So 2 electrodes, 2 transport layers, and the donor acceptor. And for every junction you add, it sort of, doubles that. So you can get very complicated multi-layer structures that, if you want to get up into those sort of high efficiency multi-junction structures.
And what about the layer thickness, the absorbing layer? I mean, it's I guess there's a sweet spot in how thick it should be, right, for maximum absorption.
Yeah, exactly. So it again depends on the materials. And I'm speaking for a field that has literally thousands of possible architectures you can make. But I would say a rule of thumb is between about 30 nanometers on the very low side and up to about 300 or so nanometers on the high side, depending on which materials you're looking at. And again, because our charge extraction is a problem, if you make it thicker and thicker, the charge extraction potentially gets worse and worse. So there's also a balance there of, I want to make the layer thicker to get the best absorption I can, but I also want to keep it thin enough that I'm able to actually get the charges out at the end of the day. So you sort of you're always looking for these little optimums in in electrical properties and optical properties, and there always tends to be a sort of trade-off that you make when you design these devices.
Can't you put like a low background voltage across the absorbing material so that you could use a different band gap that creates a lower voltage and it would still be acceptable, or to move the charges along? Would that a scheme like that help?
So for a solar cell to work, it always has what's called a built-in voltage, and that just comes from the materials that you're using. So if I have, basically if I had a structure that has symmetric contacts on it, it wouldn't know essentially which way the charges are supposed to go. So you always have some asymmetry built into your device, which puts in a built-in voltage, so that even if let's say I have the contacts short-circuited to each other, and I put light on it, it's going to force a current through that device, which is why I get current under the sun. And if I apply a certain voltage such that I stop the current from flowing, that means that the light that I'm applying is basically building up a voltage that big. So there's sort of 2 operating points: one where I have the voltage and all the current, and one where I have no current and all the voltage. And my solar cell is working in that range, and that's how it makes power.
Okay, so I guess choosing the different organic materials for the junction, you could either you'd probably have to choose smaller gaps for the.
So a smaller gap would be a smaller gap would be a redder absorber or an infrared absorber. So it really depends on the part of the spectrum you're targeting. For us, because we are specifically targeting ultraviolet light to make a transparent cell, we're trying to keep the band gaps relatively high. So we're sort of synthetically working with a class of materials that absorb 400 nanometers and higher energy. So 400 is already very blue, close to the UV. So that's sort of the target spectrum for us. But the really high efficiency people, those groups tend to be absorbing much lower band gap materials.
Wouldn't you have to modulate the band gap throughout the day, because the nature of the sunlight, early morning versus midday versus close to evening, changes?
It's an interesting idea. So even for us, the organics are very synthetically flexible, but they don't change once they're made. So the organic is what it is, and the band gap is set sort of once that material combination is made. But you definitely will see a change, and this is true of all solar cells, especially if a solar cell that's sitting at a fixed angle rather than tracking the sun. It's always going to change efficiency quite a bit as a function of the time of day, and you see certainly a red shift in the evening and in the morning when you have that. Everybody's seen a sunrise and a sunset. So yeah, it would be interesting to do that, but once the materials are made, they are absorbing where they're absorbing. That's sort of the properties we're stuck with.
No, I know, but is there a way to do anything about that? Is there any way to modulate it as the day goes on?
No, the band gap is the band gap, unfortunately. We can't do anything with it.
Well, since these are clear, I don't know, is there any way to, pull a shade or have a natural shade come down over the window that would have a different band gap where it could take advantage of the changing daylight?
Yes, where you have a totally different solar cell that could do that, sure.
If they're thin enough, then why not?
Sure, you could. I think, I gotta think about how that would work. But yeah, you could do something like that. In our case, really, our application is designed to drive an electrochromic window. So we're trying to make a window that's dimmable, you could have just a totally different solar cell that absorbs visible light, and it would look, basically our visible absorbing cells can look very dark brown or black or purple, depending on which part of the spectrum they're getting. So sure, you could do that.
Well, how much
And
of a loss?
You have a solar cell for the occasion, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, how much of a loss of efficiency is there, as the daylight changes? A lot or a little or not much?
The bigger effect is definitely the angle. So if you sort of like think about a flat surface and look at a square and then just shift the angle so the square is tilting farther and farther away from you, the area of that square that you can see gets smaller and smaller, and that's what's happening to the sun as well. So as you get at those high angles, the solar illumination is really dropping quite a bit. So yeah, I guess that doesn't necessarily mean the efficiency of the cell is going down, right? It's still, silicon is still trying to convert 26% of the light into electricity, but the amount of light that you're getting is changing a lot. So there are some small efficiency changes as a function of spectrum, but it's not a big effect compared to the effective angle.
They're small, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So you said there's thousands of different possible materials. What are some of the ones that seem to work the best that people are moving ahead with for organic solar cells?
So the nomenclature of like what those would be called is I don't think useful to anybody. So they tend to have these long acronyms based on the chemical functional groups that are attached to them. So they have very long names, but they're just different chemicals with different functional groups attached to them in different configurations. So I guess to give kind of a general sense, in our part of the spectrum where we're absorbing the UV, we tend to want relatively small molecules. We want the molecular weights to be as small as we can, not literally as small as we can, but on the smaller side. And the infrared absorbing people tend to want much larger molecules where you sort of have the electrons delocalized over these big, long, sort of almost polymeric materials. But I guess the only one to write home about is the one I mentioned before, which is called C60. So that's 60 carbons in a ball. So that is a very commonly used material for sort of visible and UV absorbing cells. And that's just a very kind of interesting molecule because it is pure carbon in this little weird form factor where it's this closed little, it basically looks like a soccer ball.
Right. So why is this still in the lab? How come it's not commercialized yet? What's the holdback?
So I think as I said, the efficiencies have been making a lot of progress recently, and that's efficiency for like your mainline, just absorb as many photons as you can, get as much efficiency as you can. That number has been going up really, really fast recently. So organic solar cells were first demonstrated in 1986. They've been around for a really long time, but it wasn't until sort of the, I guess, early mid-2000s where they really started to garner a lot of research attention and get pushed as a practical energy source. So efficiency's made a lot of progress. I would say the main drawback right now, and why you don't see them commercially, is probably more reliability. So depending on which material you're using, this varies a lot. You can have some materials that have very, very poor lifetime. And anybody who's sort of seen plastic out in the sun for a long time, you can sort of get a sense for that. There are plastics that are fantastic out in the sun for a long time and can be very durable, but getting that combination of materials right so that they're going to be stable outdoors is not easy. And the task of sort of keeping your efficiency and your lifetime both very, very high is a challenge. So I think that's sort of technologically why we don't see them yet. And we're also, all of these are industries of scale. So silicon is just this, massive global industry that's got hundreds of factories making this stuff. So there's a lot of process that goes into that for you to be able to make solar cells on a large scale and to make them cheaply, because the solar industry is dollars per watt. How much does it cost to get me this much energy? Right, that's the only thing essentially that matters in that space. And to get those costs and efficiencies up, you really need to start scaling. So we're kind of trying to prove our technology in terms of efficiency and reliability. And once we do that, then we can start building up the scale. And And I do think they will be a technology that will be competitive, but it is a little bit slow getting out of the lab right now, and that's where we are.
Are you going to do it just for Windows, or what are some other applications you're looking at?
I think we can really challenge for visible absorbing mainstream solar eventually. We're going to start with Windows because it's an application that just can't be touched by these other mature inorganic technologies. So if you want to get into a space that silicon can do, it's probably going to beat you. So we want to be in a place where there are no other competitors. We have sort of a cornered market in the transparent solar space. So I think it's a really good place for organics to begin. And then once we start to build up some of that scale and figure out how to manufacture modules on a larger scale, I think we can sort of build on the progress that's happening right now in the community. We'll 5-10 years from now, we'll probably have a 22-25% efficient organic solar cell. And if you can make that thing at scale, you can certainly compete with silicon in cost once you're scaled up. And then we're left with all these other natural advantages like extreme lightweight. And you can basically print this stuff out like newspaper and just put it on every surface with no additional infrastructure required. So I sort of have maybe a grander vision for what these solar cells are capable of than most do. But I really do think they will eventually be a totally competitive mainstream solar technology with time.
Okay, well, very good. So what's the best way for people to find out more and to get in touch?
So I think the stuff I talked about today is stuff that's being worked on at our startup company, and that's Andluca Technologies, ANDLUCA. So you can check us out there. And you can also, just for me personally, you can follow me on Twitter at Quinn, QUINN, Burlingame, BURLINGAME. And I think that's it.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Quinn, last question. What do you think is possible maybe in the next 5 years in terms of efficiency and deployment of these transparent organic solar cells?
So for the transparent ones, efficiency is not a number that we talk about too much because we're sort of self-limiting ourselves to only this tiny little part of the solar spectrum. So I think an efficiency that would be great for us is like 2 to 3% of the total spectrum, because that would mean we're really efficiently harvesting the UV. So I think we will be somewhere in that range, and then we're going to be stuck with the next sort of challenges of the reliability and the scaling. So within 5 years, I think we'll have certainly a very reliable solar cell in the 2 to 3% efficiency range, and we'll be making solar window inserts that you can buy and regulate the light in your home.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Quinn, thanks for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great talk with you, Richard. Thanks.
All right, hold on a second.
Sure.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.